Hi there everybody, this is Organisational Behaviour, Buzzy 1021. In this class, we're going to talk about technology and its effects on organisations. So by the end of this video, you should hopefully be able to describe what we call the replacement effects of technology. And this is a way of expanding on our discussions of technology as an external factor that can determine organisations, spelled correctly, organisational behaviours. You should then be able to identify what we call compensatory effects, which help us to understand why technology doesn't always have the replacement effects that we're going to have described earlier. And then finally, you should be able to apply what's known as the socio-technical systems perspective, if you can spit it out, to organisational cases. So the core reading is Huczynski and Buchanan's chapter 3 in the 6th and 9th editions. So let's get started. We talked in a previous class about the notion of environmental determinism, the idea that when the environment around an organisation changes, the organisation will somehow naturally respond. A particular branch of this thinking is known as technological determinism, and it suggests that when a technology changes, things inside an organisation will naturally change. So let's think about what kinds of things typically can change inside an organisation. There's a few things that have been, sorry, my phone just buzzed. There's a few things that have been identified. Primarily, when we talk about technology changing things in organisations, what we usually mean is some form of automation. That is the replacement of humans and human activities by machines. This is automation, the automation of activities. And this is thought to be attractive to many organisations because it makes them more efficient, more effective, makes them have fewer costs. But it has costs to other members of those organisations. In particular, the people whose work has been automated can find themselves being victims of what's known as de-skilling and technological redundancy. So let's drill down into this a little bit more. What are we talking about when we talk about technology? Well, on the one hand, we've got material technology. These are the physical objects, the things which can replace humans. So, a great example of this would be instead of having a human standing on an assembly line, you replace those humans by robot arms. These are material technologies that can replace the physical acts previously done by humans. Material technologies, though, can also replace some of the cognitive acts that would traditionally be done by humans, such as storing information. So literally physically storing it on paper or in documents or on computer disks. This is an example of a material technology replacing not just a physical activity, but also a cognitive, a thoughtful activity. So we have material technologies. We also have computational technologies. Computational technologies typically cannot replace physical tasks because they have to work in combination with a material technology to do that. But on their own, they can replace cognitive tasks or thinking tasks. And an example of this would be something like a spell checker, which scans your document for you and identifies words and can even correct them automatically for you without you having to do any thinking. So this is an example of a computational or non-material technology. So what are the effects of, that's in the wrong place. What are the effects of these kinds of technologies? There's a number. Firstly, if you can replace a human being with a machine, you can typically save a great deal of money. You can have fewer people in your organisations, you can have less hierarchy, less resistance, less politics, loads of stuff which lots of people that lead organisations like. However, it's not only the case that machines have to directly replace a human, machines can also increase the effectiveness of humans. And you can look at this, just go to your local fast food restaurant, at McDonald's or something, and you'll see a small number of human beings can use machines to produce a great number of products. They can use machines to cook 10 burgers at a time rather than just one burger at a time. So this isn't just about increasing efficiency, it's also increasing the effectiveness of members of the organisation. And this is one of the, I've pressed all the wrong buttons. One of the real benefits to technologies. And it's one of the reasons why technology is a core principle of what's known as scientific management. Technology is thought by Frederick Taylor, who hopefully you've come across on your other courses, to be one of the key principles of organising effectively. The idea is anything that can be done by a machine should be done by a machine, because machines are almost always cheaper, more efficient and more effective than relying on human beings alone. That's the positive story on technology for organisations, but there's another way of thinking about it. Technologies, when they replace human beings, they lead to what's known as technological redundancy. So you can have material technological redundancy when, for example, a robot replaces a human being. So somebody was previously doing a job that is now being done by a machine, and they no longer have a job. They are made redundant. Even if it's not their job, they no longer have a place within the organisation, even if they want to be a member of it, and even if they previously were a member of that organisation. So, the example of a robot would be a great illustration there. But you can also have computational technological redundancy, where a piece of computational technology can also replace the work done previously by a person, meaning there's no space for that person in the organisation. And an example of this would be something like a chatbot. And this is where we start to see some of the controversies around technology in organisations. Technology is usually seen as a choice, adopting technology is usually seen as a choice by organisations that can have benefits for the organisation, but can have costs to members of the organisation and the wider society. A recent example of this has been recent discussions around self-driving cars. It's estimated that in North America and many European countries, driving a car is a main activity, working activity for something like 50% of adult males, whether that's driving a van or a lorry or a taxi or an Uber. Replacing those people with self-driving cars, of course, would mean a huge number of people would be made redundant. They wouldn't have jobs. So in some countries, and Donald Trump's administration in America recently did this, they've decided not to support self-driving cars at work for precisely this reason, because if all these workers were suddenly out of work, if they were suddenly made technologically redundant, there'd be a huge social problem. Another negative effect of technology is what's known as de-skilling. So de-skilling involves not fully replacing a human being by technology, but taking many of their key skills and activities away. So an example here would be, a kitchen where rather than actually prepare the meals from fresh, all the chef does is put a pre-prepared meal into a microwave and heat it up. They're no longer having to use any of their skills. The technology is replacing their skills for them. This is known as technological de-skilling. We see examples of this with computational technologies. Like most people don't know many phone numbers anymore. Why don't people know phone numbers? Because they're all stored in your phone. The phone has memorized them for you, so you've forgotten them. This, of course, has significant detrimental effects for the quality of working lives, the quality of activities that people do in organisations, but also, as we're going to see as this session progresses, for the power between members of organisations and the leadership and management of organisations. But a long time ago, these kinds of controversies were identified. Taylorism, for example, scientific management, was subject to several inquiries by the US government and other governments around the world for its negative effects on members of organisations. Not just for making people redundant, but also for de-skilling people, so that people lost technical skills and we had to rely more and more on machines. And we see this throughout popular culture as well, with the idea of resistance to technology. Anybody who's familiar with the legend of John Henry might be familiar with this. So John Henry was supposedly a super strong man who would lay railroad tracks with a hammer, and his employer tried to replace him with a machine, and John Henry went in competition with this machine and destroyed it, proving that man is better than a machine. But others have taken not just to showing that they're better than machines, but actually destroying machines, and this is an approach often known as Ludditism or Luddism, associated with a historical legend called Ned Ludd, who actually supposedly came from around Nottinghamshire, who would inspire workers to break into factories at night which had installed machines to de-skill them, and smash the machines to resist them. Because technology, material and computational technology, when it's imposed and introduced into an organisation, can be remarkably controversial. So when we talk about technological de-skilling and we talk about technological redundancy, these can be known as replacement effects. They're technology replacing work traditionally done by human members of an organisation. But if we look empirically at the introduction of technology in many organisations, we see replacement effects often don't occur. There are many technologies which take a long time to introduce, and we don't see huge levels of unemployment, technological redundancy, or de-skilling. We definitely see some, but not as much as you would predict. There's lots of technologies that organisations adopt without making huge numbers of workers redundant. So why not? Well, this has led to theorizations of what are called compensatory mechanisms. And these are processes which might delay replacement effects or mitigate or deflect some negative replacement effects. So one example of a replacement effect being deflected would be when technologies are introduced, they often create new jobs. If you install new computer systems, well, then there's a whole host of people who have to manage, administer, and check up on those computer systems. So this is thought to be a way that technology is compensated, right? Instead of just making people redundant, you introduce technology and it ends up creating new jobs. And this is one of the things which many people have found when they've tried to install new technologies in organisations. They often end up costing them a lot more and having to run several systems at once, and they often end up having to employ more people to do more work rather than replacing them, because the new products create all these new jobs that hadn't been foreseen. Technology can lower costs, can create efficiencies, and that can increase demand, which means there's more production, which means actually there's more employment. For many technologies, there's a significant time lag between adoption, implementation, and implications. If you launch a new machine product in a factory with a robot, it can take years, if not decades, to design, install, build the factory, get it up and running, by which time many people will have left the organisation anyway. There's a huge deal of hedging or trying to mitigate risks where companies don't fully jump into, or not companies, organisations don't fully jump into just a single technology. They try it just a little bit to see if it works. There's also huge learning curves for many technologies. They take time. There's a time lag. There's also a sense that many organisations don't adopt technologies, not because the technologies don't work, but because they don't think there's a market for demand to sufficiently justify the investments in technology. And many technologies are very costly. And finally, there are issues of technological limitations. Lots of technologies just simply don't deliver. So all of these effects, these compensatory effects or compensatory mechanisms, mean that not all technologies have the effect that you would think. So in place of this sort of simple cause and effect determinism model, we could draw a more realistic model that looks kind of something like this, right? So you have new jobs that are filtered by these compensatory mechanisms that leads to some form of efficiency, that can lead to technological redundancy and de-skilling, but they are also moderated by resistance, social values and so on and so forth. Okay, so where are we? Well, we've talked about replacement effects. We've just talked about compensatory effects. Let's move on and just talk about this thing called the socio-technical systems perspective. So, socio-technical systems analysis has a slightly different focus to technological determinism. Rather than thinking about the ways that technologies change behaviours, the socio-technical systems perspective is based on the idea that an organisation is made up not just of material and computational technologies and people, but also has a social technology. And these can be described as the patterns of behaviour, the relationships between people, the norms, the values, which make the organisation work. And in the socio-technical systems perspective, we try to understand what's the relationship between the way a technology works and the way these relationships between people that order behaviours within an organisation work. And what researchers have found is that there are many good technologies, many effective technologies and many efficient technologies which don't match or fit the social system within an organisation, and this creates problems. So an early example of this kind of thinking is Walker and Guest's analysis of workers on assembly lines. What they found was that while workers on assembly lines used technology to produce more, actually life working on an assembly line was kind of miserable. People found that the pace of work was too much, it was too repetitive, it was really boring, it had really minimum skill requirements. So although people liked the pay they received for the work, they'd often do it just for a short time and then leave, because they just didn't enjoy it at all. It was really, really boring work. And this led not just to higher staff turnover, a need to pay higher wages to staff, and a whole range of unintended costs and consequences. Another good example of the socio-technical systems perspective, and this is where some of the key theories in socio-technical systems came from, is Trist and Bamford. They analysed a mining organisation who was shifting from what was known as Longwall mining to a different approach to mining, which actually I can't even remember what it was called, and it really doesn't matter that much. Short wall mining, that was what it was called, short wall mining. Essentially, the mine was previously organised into small teams who were given a little bit of the mine face, and they were just given some tools and left to it. And they were told, we need you to produce this much, ore from the mine, but how you do it, when you do it, is up to you. And these teams of people worked together. They created their own patterned interactions, their own divisions of labour, their own hierarchies and specialisations. They created what we've called previously informal organisations that were incredibly effective and that had lasted for many years. But the company decided to install a new technology which moved from this team-based way of working to a more production line way of working, where instead of working teams, everyone would just go and individually be given a task. You have to go and do this. And that task would then be dependent on somebody else doing something before you, and would be interdependent with someone waiting for your work. And although the technology was sound, what Trist and Bamford found was it didn't work. And it primarily didn't work because the whole mine and all of the informal organisations were organised around these teams, which then just got broken up. So people didn't work effectively. People stopped coming into work. People didn't check up on each other. And actually, this new technology just didn't work. Not because the technology didn't work, but because it didn't match the socio-system. So this led Eric Trist, one of the authors, to develop a way of thinking about organisations as comprising a technical system, which is the material and computational technologies, and a social system, both of whom have their own norms and ways of working, their own patterned interactions, their own role systems, their own divisions of labour. And he said if the two things don't match each other, the introduction of a technology won't work. However, he also said it's very, very difficult to predict what's going to happen in advance when you introduce a new technology. So his advice was, rather than try to detail every operation of a technology, because this would imply that you had a complete grasp of the social system, not just the technical system. The best thing to do when introducing technologies is to set a minimum critical specification. So the leadership should say, here's the technology, here's what we want it to do, and then give it to the workers to organise themselves as a new socio-technical system. In fact, recently I was able to do some research with a large knowledge company that had invested in a brand new technology, a piece of computational technology. And there was huge resistance to this technology. It had been launched 3 times through soft launches where they'd asked people to use it, to hard launches where they'd forced people to use this new computer program. And still the workers wouldn't use it. And our advice, researching this company, was stop telling people what to do, give them the tools, show them the benefits, let them figure out how to use it themselves. And this has led to a much wider adoption by using this minimal critical specification approach. And we're going to develop an account of the socio-technical systems perspective more as this course goes on, but essentially what this approach means is, while managers and leaders of organisations can design and adopt technologies, it means less management control in the implementation of those technologies. And this brings us on to another key issue that is exposed in the socio-technical systems perspective, and that is that technology is always related with power within organisations. This is a classic example from what's known as science and technology studies. This picture on this slide is of a bridge going out of New York towards the Long Island beaches. And it was designed at a specific height, and that was a height at which buses couldn't go underneath it. And what this meant was essentially that poor people that ride on buses, and often from minority groups, couldn't get to the beaches beyond. This is an example of the ways that technology can be used as an instrument of power to regulate relationships between people. And this is a key part of the socio-technical systems perspective. According to the socio-technical systems perspective, a lot of the time when organisations seek to introduce new technologies, it's not to gain efficiencies or to reduce costs. When they try to replace workers, make them technologically redundant, or to de-skill them, it's usually an attempt to take power from the workers, so skills from the workers, and give that power and those skills to management. However, this can lead to what Clegg and Dunkerley call a vicious circle of control. They say what can happen in many organisational settings is managers have a perceived need for control. They feel like the workers have too much control because, say, they have specialist skills. So they design a new technology with new policy and a new social system that produces lower skilled activities with less discretion or less freedom of choice from workers as to how they do the work, less variety. And this leads to a decrease in commitment among the workforce, lower levels of satisfaction, which in turn encourages employee misbehaviour. So employees not turning up for work on time, employees not really doing what they're told, employees just not going the extra mile. And of course, what does that do? That then leads to a greater need for management control to reduce misbehaviour, which starts the whole cycle again. So Clegg and Dunkerley say, from a socio-technical systems perspective, understanding that technologies aren't just about improving efficiencies, they're also embedded in power and politics in organisations, allows us to understand how sometimes organisations can get trapped into these cycles of control where they're continually investing in technologies that never quite do what they thought, because there's not enough awareness of not just the technical system but also the social subsystem. Okay, so hopefully through this video you've been able to get a good grasp of what we're talking about when we say replacement effects of technology. We've thought about some of the compensatory effects that can mediate technological change in organisations, and we've briefly introduced the socio-technical systems perspective. If you've got any questions, please come to the Ask Me Anything or raise them on the forum. See ya!